Well, let's delve further into this with Raymond Gilpin. He is the Chief Economist and Head of Strategy at UNDP Africa. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Gilpin. And let's just start off with your findings on why these ratings agencies, as you say, are sometimes overrating, underrating, and even contradicting each other when it comes to African nations. What are they getting wrong?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. What we did find was that the methodologies that the credit ratings agencies use, while they're standard worldwide, they face some challenges on the African continent. And one is the availability of data to make objective determinations. And when this data is either late or unavailable, and then a lot of subjective judgment calls are made. And quite often, these do not go African countries' way, which is why we found that there seems to be an overwhelming amount of countries that face higher costs because the ratings themselves not really reflect actual risk. They do reflect, in some cases, perceived risk in these countries.
But I want to get into the lack of sufficient hard data, because the report also points to this, lack of sufficient hard data on African economies. And they say the resulting impact is that there's subjective assessments when we talk about the risk of lending to Africa. Whose fault is this really? Is it African governments or is it the ratings firms?
I think it's there has to be a combined approach to this, because what our findings show that when this is not done, the costs to African countries in terms of higher interest rates and also in terms of lower development financing inflows for the 19 countries we surveyed came up to about $74 billion. That's more than the total amount of aid that African countries receive on an annual basis. You look at the interest rates that African countries, some of the poorest in the world, pay about 12% on average, while the developed world, the calculated interest rate is about 3%. The bottom line here is that countries that could afford it less are paying much more, and that doesn't seem right.
It doesn't make sense. Well, then, on that note, give us some more insight into how much this subjectivity in credit ratings has cost African nations so far.
Well, I think it's costing in terms of the higher interest payments. Today, over 700 million Africans live in countries that pay more in terms of debt servicing than they pay in terms of investing in health and education. So the first point I would make is that this is not just a financing issue, it's a development priority, because countries that don't invest in health and education are leaving so many people behind. The second cost is that as African countries are thinking about and talking about transitions like green transitions, energy transitions, governance transitions, infrastructure investments, the financing gap for most for African countries as a whole is about $50 billion. And if we have ratings that are actually discouraging investment flows from coming into Africa, that's problematic as well from a development financing perspective.
Quite right. And of course, this is all part of that call or that cry to reform the global financial systems and the systems that don't benefit Africa. But what then are the solutions when we talk about reducing that subjectivity of Africa's credit ratings? How do we approach the ratings firms?
I think one of the issues is that we have to take on board the reality that it has to start with the data. And so at UNDP, we have launched something called the Africa Credit Ratings Initiative, where we work with other institutions who are in this space, like the African Union, the UN Commission for Africa, Economic Commission for Africa, and we say, what is it that we can do to upskill African officials to ensure that they are able to not just source the data, but understand the questions that are asked. In credit ratings processes, it's not just how much you're growing as an economy or how well you're doing with inflation. There are institutional and governance questions that also go into these ratings that countries need to understand. So we are working with African countries to build that capacity. We're also working with African countries and statistical offices to start working on systems that would provide this data in an accurate and a timely manner. And the third thing that we're doing is that we're providing surge assistance to African countries. We're providing experts who understand this space, who will work alongside African countries to enable them to make the right decisions and to negotiate ratings that are more favorable and more reflective of actual risk.